I never imagined the worst day of my life would begin with me smiling in an airport drop-off lane, pretending I didn't mind being left behind again. My name is Maren Ellsworth. I'm 35 years old, and for most of my life, I believed being the dependable daughter was simply my role in the family. Every holiday, every celebration, every emergency somehow revolved around my younger brother, Landon. If someone had to give something up, it was always me. If someone had to stay behind, it was always me. I kept telling myself that families worked because someone was willing to sacrifice. I just didn't realize I had become the only one making those sacrifices. That Tuesday morning started before sunrise. I had packed everyone's luggage into the back of my SUV while my parents argued about boarding times, and my brother laughed through a video call with his college friends. They were flying across the country for Landon's Graduate Business Awards ceremony, something my father had been talking about for months. Richard Ellsworth treated the event as if our family name were finally being carved into history. "This is the moment people will remember," he had said at dinner nearly every night that week. Nobody noticed I had quietly cleared everyone's plates afterward. Nobody asked whether I wanted to go. I had asked once months earlier whether there might be room for me on the trip. My mother, Claire, smiled with that careful expression she always used when delivering disappointing news. "Orny, someone has to stay home with Baxter. Hotels don't allow large dogs, and hiring a sitter for nearly a week would be expensive." Then she reached across the table and squeezed my hand as though that erased the sting. "Besides, you always understand." Those words had followed me my entire life. You always understand. You never complain. You're stronger than your brother. You're older. You're more responsible. Every compliment came wrapped around another excuse for why I deserved less. By 7 that morning, I was already loading the final suitcase while Landon stood beside the driveway scrolling through his phone. "Thanks again for driving us," he said without looking up. "Flights this early are brutal." I forced a smile. "Just enjoy your trip." He nodded absently. "I will." I don't think he meant to sound ungrateful. That was the strange thing about Landon. He wasn't cruel. He had simply grown up in a house where everyone revolved around him. And eventually, he stopped noticing the orbit. My father climbed into the passenger seat while my mother reminded me twice to water her orchids, and once to bring the mail inside every afternoon. By the time we reached the airport, I felt less like a daughter and more like an employee finishing a shift. Richard checked his watch before I had even parked. "We're cutting it close," he muttered. "Pop the trunk." I stepped out and hauled 4 heavy suitcases onto the sidewalk while travelers hurried past us. Landon finally slipped his phone into his pocket long enough to sling his backpack over one shoulder. My mother adjusted his jacket collar the way she used to when he was 12. She kissed his cheek. "This weekend is all about you." I couldn't remember the last time anyone had looked at me like that. When they finished unloading, I waited, hoping someone might hug me goodbye. My mother offered a quick wave instead. My father said, "Lock the doors at night. Don't forget the sprinkler schedule." Then he turned away. Landon smiled. "Well, bring you something back." It was meant to be kind, but somehow it hurt even more. I watched the 3 of them disappear into the sliding glass doors. Not one of them looked back. As I drove away from the terminal, I turned off the radio because the silence felt easier than pretending to enjoy the morning. The airport faded behind me while traffic thinned toward the highway. I remember thinking how strange it was that I didn't even feel angry anymore. Disappointment had become familiar enough to feel ordinary. My chest tightened just as I merged onto the interstate. At first I blamed stress. I'd been working long hours helping clients prepare for retirement investments, and I'd barely slept the night before. I rolled down the window and took a deep breath, but the pressure spread across my chest like a heavy weight. My left arm tingled. My vision blurred for just a second before clearing again. "Not now," I whispered. I reached for the bottle of water in the cup holder, but my hand trembled so badly I dropped it onto the passenger floor. The pain sharpened. Every heartbeat felt uneven. as if my heart couldn't decide whether to race or stop altogether. I pulled into a nearly empty parking lot beside a small shopping center a few miles from the airport. My breathing became shallow, my fingers felt numb. For the first time in years, I admitted I needed help. I grabbed my phone and called my mother. She answered after 3 rings. I almost cried with relief. "Mom." I struggled to breathe. "Something's wrong." "I can't, Maren," she interrupted impatiently. I could hear airport announcements in the background. "We're boarding." "Please, my chest, I think I need." She sighed loudly enough that I pulled the phone away from my ear. "Stop acting. You're probably having another anxiety episode because you hate being left out." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Mom, please. We're not doing this today," she said. "Everything doesn't have to become about you." The line went silent. She had hung up. I stared at the screen for several seconds before calling my father. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Nothing. Then I called Landon. It rang longer than I expected. Finally it disconnected. I tried once more. This time it went directly to voicemail too. I left one message because I didn't know what else to do. "Please, somebody call me back. I don't think I'm okay." My voice barely sounded like my own. My breathing became more difficult with every passing second. Sweat soaked through my blouse despite the air conditioner blasting against my face. I rested my forehead on the steering wheel and closed my eyes for just a moment. Maybe someone would call back. Maybe Mom would realize how frightened I sounded. Maybe Dad would listen to the voicemail. Maybe Landon would notice. My phone remained silent. I remember hearing an airplane overhead and wondering if it was theirs. I wondered whether they were laughing while fastening their seat belts. Whether my mother was already planning which restaurant they'd visit after landing. Whether anyone had even considered calling me one more time. My heartbeat skipped again. My vision narrowed until the parking lot blurred into patches of grey. I reached for the door handle, thinking if I could just get outside, maybe someone would see me. My fingers never reached it. The last thing I remember was someone pounding hard against my driver's side window and a distant voice shouting, "Ma'am, can you hear me? Stay with me?" Then everything disappeared into darkness. When I opened my eyes again, the first thing I noticed was the steady beeping of a heart monitor. The second was the silence. Hospitals have a different kind of quiet. It isn't peaceful. It's the kind of silence that reminds you something almost went terribly wrong. My throat felt dry, my chest ached with every breath, and there were wires attached to places I couldn't even see. For a few confused seconds, I couldn't remember where I was. Then the memories rushed back all at once. The airport, my mother's voice. "Stop acting." The unanswered calls. The pounding on my car window. I turned my head toward the door, expecting to see someone sitting beside my bed. My mother always said family showed up when it mattered most. My father constantly lectured me about loyalty. Landon always promised we'd be there for each other, no matter what. There wasn't a single familiar face in the room. A nurse walked in carrying a clipboard. She smiled warmly when she realized I was awake. "Good morning. You're finally back with us." My voice barely worked. "How long?" "About 14 hours. You were brought in yesterday afternoon." She adjusted one of the monitors before checking my pulse. "You're lucky someone found you when they did." Lucky. It was an odd word. It didn't feel like luck. It felt like survival. "Who found me?" I asked. "A parking enforcement officer noticed your car had been sitting there with the engine running. He called emergency services immediately." She paused before adding softly, "I probably saved your life." I closed my eyes. A complete stranger had cared enough to stop. The people who had known me for 35 years hadn't even returned a phone call. A few minutes later, a woman in her early 50s entered the room wearing a white coat. Her name badge read Duda, Hannah Pierce, Cardiology. She introduced herself before pulling up a chair beside my bed. "How are you feeling?" she asked. "Like I got hit by a truck." She smiled gently. "That's understandable." Then her expression became more serious. "You experienced a dangerous cardiac arrhythmia. Your heart wasn't maintaining a normal rhythm." Another 10 or 15 minutes without treatment could have had a very different outcome. I stared at her, trying to process the words. But I've never had heart problems. Maybe not diagnosed ones. She folded her hands together. We're still running tests, but I don't believe this happened without an underlying cause. I nodded slowly, though nothing made sense anymore. I'd always considered myself healthy. I exercised when I had time. I didn't smoke. I rarely drank. My annual physicals were always routine. Can I call my family? I asked quietly. Of course. She stood to leave. Try to get some rest too. Stress isn't helping your recovery. The moment she left, I reached for my phone on the bedside table. It had been placed inside a clear plastic bag with my purse and car keys. My battery was nearly dead, but it still powered on. 3 missed calls. My heart actually lifted for a second. Then I saw they were all from unknown hospital numbers while I had been unconscious. Nothing from my parents. Nothing from Landon. I opened my messages. The last text I had sent my mother read, "Please answer. Something is seriously wrong." It still showed as delivered but unread. My father had never opened the voicemail notification. Landon hadn't responded either. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe they were still flying. Maybe they hadn't turned their phones back on yet. Maybe. I called my mother again. It rang 6 times before going to voicemail. "Hi, Mom, it's me." My voice cracked. "I'm in the hospital," they said. They said it was my heart. "Please call me when you hear this." I immediately called my father. Straight to voicemail again. Then Landon. No answer. I leaned back against the pillow, feeling strangely embarrassed. Why did I still feel like I had to convince my own family that I deserved help? An hour passed. Then another. Nurses came and went. Blood was drawn. More tests followed. Every time footsteps approached my room, I instinctively looked toward the door, hoping one of them had finally arrived. Every single time, it was someone else. Around lunchtime, I made the mistake of opening social media. My mother's newest post appeared first, a smiling airport selfie. Richard stood proudly beside Landon, while my mother captioned it off to celebrate our favorite graduate. "So proud of this young man." Hundreds of people had already commented with congratulations. I stared at the picture until it blurred. Favorite. Maybe she hadn't meant anything by the word. Maybe she had. Either way, it settled into my chest heavier than any diagnosis. Another post appeared a few hours later. The 3 of them sitting at a seafood restaurant near the coast. Landon held up a huge plate while my father grinned beside him. My mother wrote, "First night of an unforgettable trip." Unforgettable. I looked around my empty hospital room and almost laughed. Mine was becoming unforgettable too. Just for very different reasons. Later that evening, I overheard laughter from the room across the hall. A teenage girl had apparently broken her ankle during a soccer game. Her parents, grandparents, younger brother, and even 2 cousins had crowded around her bed with balloons and flowers. They were arguing over who had brought the wrong flavor of pudding. The girl rolled her eyes, clearly embarrassed by all the attention. I found myself smiling despite everything. Then the smile disappeared as I realized how desperately I wished someone would walk into my room, carrying nothing more than a bottle of water, and ask if I was okay. Instead, a nurse noticed me watching through the partially open door. She stepped inside and gently closed it. "Family can be complicated," she said quietly. I nodded without trusting myself to answer. "Would you like me to call someone else? A friend?" The question caught me off guard. I had friends, good ones, co-workers who respected me, neighbors who always waved. But somehow I couldn't bring myself to tell them what had happened before my own family even knew. "Maybe later," I whispered. She squeezed my shoulder before leaving. That night I barely slept. Every vibration from my phone made me reach for it. Every notification turned out to be an email, a work reminder, or a spam message. Around 6 the next morning, Jutta Pierce returned carrying several test results. Her face was calm, but I immediately sensed this conversation would change something. She pulled her chair close to my bed again. "Maren, I'd like to ask you something important." "Okay. Has anyone in your family ever mentioned a history of heart disease? Sudden cardiac death?" Unexplained fainting episodes, anything like that? I frowned. My parents always said our family was healthy. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked down at the chart in her hands before meeting my eyes again. Because some of your test results suggest this may not have started with you. My stomach tightened. What does that mean? Teacher, Pierce inhaled slowly. It means I think we need to start asking questions about your family's medical history. I had no idea that those questions were about to uncover a truth far more painful than the heart condition itself. I always believed my childhood had been normal, until I started looking at it through the eyes of someone who almost died. Funny how surviving something changes the questions you ask yourself. Instead of wondering why my parents loved my brother more, I began wondering whether they had ever truly seen me at all. Pierce's question about family history echoed in my mind long after she left the room. Had anyone ever mentioned heart disease? The answer should have been easy. It wasn't. I remembered my grandfather dying suddenly before I turned 10. My parents had always called it one of those things. I remembered my father taking medication every morning with breakfast, but when I asked about it as a teenager, he brushed it off and said it was just for blood pressure. I remembered occasional conversations ending the moment I walked into the room. At the time, none of it seemed unusual. Now every memory felt like a puzzle piece that had been sitting in front of me my entire life. While waiting for more test results, my mind drifted back to moments I'd spent years trying to forget. I was 8 when Landon wanted the bicycle our parents couldn't afford. A week before my birthday, my mother gently suggested postponing my party because money was tight. I happily agreed. A few days later, Landon rolled into the driveway on a brand new bike while my birthday cake quietly disappeared from the family calendar. I remember telling my friends we were celebrating later. We never did. When I was 15, I earned a place at an expensive summer leadership program. My guidance counselor said it could strengthen my college applications. My father congratulated me before explaining that Landon had just been accepted into an elite baseball camp. "We'll have to choose one," he said. I already knew which one it would be. I told him baseball would probably help Landon more. He smiled proudly and called me mature. Looking back, I realized maturity was simply the name they gave my willingness to disappear. Even after college, nothing really changed. When our grandmother needed someone to help organize her finances after my grandfather passed away, I drove across town every weekend for nearly 2 years. Landon rarely visited. My parents thanked me privately but praised him publicly for always being there for family. I never corrected them. I had spent so many years convincing myself their approval would eventually come if I just kept proving my worth, that I stopped noticing how uneven everything had become. Around noon, my phone finally rang. My heart jumped when I saw my mother's name. I answered immediately. "Mum, we just landed," she said casually, as if we had spoken only an hour earlier. "I saw your voicemail. Are you feeling better now?" "Better." As though I had caught a cold. "I'm still in the hospital." There was a pause. "Still?" "The doctor said I had a serious cardiac event." Another pause, then she lowered her voice. "Orny, you really scared us." I almost laughed at the irony. "Scared you? We didn't know whether to believe you," she replied. "You've always pushed yourself too hard, and sometimes stress makes everything seem worse." I gripped the blanket tightly. "Mom, they said I almost died," she sighed softly. "Let's not exaggerate." Before I could answer, I heard restaurant chatter in the background. Someone asked whether she wanted clam chowder or lobster bisque. My mother covered the phone with her hand for a second before returning. "Listen, we're about to order lunch. Your father says the doctors know what they're doing, so just focus on getting some rest. We'll talk when we get home." "You're staying?" I asked quietly. "Well, yes, the ceremony is tomorrow. We've already paid for everything." She sounded genuinely confused that I would even ask. Besides, what would we accomplish by flying back now? My chest tightened again, though this time it wasn't my heart. "Nothing," I whispered. "Exactly. You're stable now?" She spoke with the comforting tone mothers usually reserved for frightened children. "We'll see you in a few days." The call ended before I said goodbye. I stared at the phone until the screen went black. Somehow, hearing her voice had made everything worse. At least silence left room for hope. Her words had erased it completely. That evening, my father finally called. I answered, though I wasn't sure why. "How are you holding up?" he asked. His tone was brisk, almost businesslike. "Still recovering." "Good." He cleared his throat. "The important thing is that you're alive." I waited. Surely there would be an apology. Instead, he continued, "Your mother feels terrible about what happened." I closed my eyes. She didn't sound like it. She was under pressure. We were boarding. People say things when they're stressed. "Dead?" I begged for help. He remained silent for a moment before speaking again. "Let's not turn this into something bigger than it needs to be." My stomach dropped. Bigger. "You survived. Dwelling on blame won't change anything." There it was, the Ellsworth family motto. Don't discuss uncomfortable truths. Just move on. "When are you coming home?" I asked. "Sunday evening." "You're staying for the whole vacation?" Landon worked hard for this. His answer came so naturally that I realized he didn't even hear what he was saying. In his mind, those two facts belonged together. My near-death experience and my brother's celebration were competing priorities, and somehow the graduation still ranked higher. Before hanging up, he added, "We'll visit after you're discharged." Visit, as though I were recovering from routine surgery instead of wondering why my own parents hadn't believed I was dying. The following morning, Pierce entered my room carrying a thick folder instead of her usual tablet. Her expression had changed. She looked less curious and more concerned. "I requested records from your primary physician and several regional hospitals," she explained. Something didn't add up. I frowned. "Did you find anything?" She placed the folder on the bedside table and opened it carefully. Inside were photocopies of medical reports, referral letters, and laboratory summaries dating back more than a decade. She pointed to one page highlighted in yellow. "This report references genetic screening recommendations for immediate family members." I scanned the document without fully understanding it. Then my eyes landed on one familiar word, Ellsworth. Below it was my father's full name. Pierce watched my face carefully. "Maren," she said quietly, "did your father ever tell you he had already met with a cardiologist about inherited heart disease years ago?" My mouth went dry. I looked from the paper back to her, unable to speak. Somewhere deep inside me, a truth I hadn't even imagined was beginning to wake up. There are moments in life when one sentence quietly divides everything into before and after. For me, it wasn't hearing that I had a genetic heart condition. It wasn't waking up in a hospital bed. It wasn't even listening to my mother tell me to stop acting while I begged for help. It was sitting across from Hannah Pierce as she slid a 10-year-old medical report toward me and asked if my father had ever told me about it. He hadn't. Not one word. I picked up the first page with trembling hands. It was addressed to my father and dated 11 years earlier. At the top was the name of a cardiology practice less than 20 minutes from our house. Halfway down the page, several sentences had been highlighted. Because of the family's history of sudden cardiac death, immediate biological relatives should undergo routine cardiac evaluation and genetic screening. Early detection significantly reduces the risk of life-threatening complications. I read the paragraph 3 times before the words finally settled into place. Immediate biological relatives, that included me. There has to be some mistake, I whispered. Pierce gently shook her head. "We've already confirmed the records." She opened another folder. "There are follow-up appointments here as well." She handed me a second document. This one listed yearly evaluations. Patient Landon Ellsworth. My younger brother's name appeared again and again over the next several years. Echocardiogram, stress test, cardiac monitoring, follow-up consultation. Every appointment had been completed. Every recommendation had been followed. I stared at the pages until the letters blurred together. "Why would he have these?" I finally asked. Pierce chose her words carefully. because your father brought him in for preventive screening. What about me? She looked genuinely uncomfortable. There are no records indicating you were ever referred. The room suddenly felt smaller. I wasn't angry yet. Anger required certainty. What I felt first was confusion so overwhelming that it almost hurt more than the pain in my chest. Maybe. I struggled to find an explanation. Maybe they thought I didn't need it. Judith. Pierce remained silent for a moment before answering. Maren, inherited heart conditions don't work that way. If one child is considered at risk, every biological child should be evaluated. I looked down at my hands. So they were supposed to test both of us. Yes. She didn't hesitate. That is the standard recommendation. A strange numbness spread through me. For years I had assumed my life was simply filled with bad luck and unfortunate timing. Suddenly I was forced to consider a possibility I never wanted to believe. What if this hadn't been an accident at all? What if someone had made a decision that my health mattered less? Judith. Pierce leaned forward. I'm not here to judge your family. I only want you to understand that if this condition had been diagnosed earlier, medication and monitoring could very likely have prevented what happened last week. I closed my eyes. The sentence echoed inside my head. Could have prevented what happened. My heart didn't almost stop because medicine had failed me. It almost stopped because I had never been given the chance to know I was in danger. After Judith. Pierce left, I sat alone for nearly an hour without moving. Every childhood memory suddenly looked different. My father insisting Landon never miss his yearly checkups. My mother reminding him to schedule appointments. The afternoons when they left together while I stayed home finishing homework. I had always assumed they were routine physicals. Now I realized they weren't routine at all. They were protecting him. Just not me. Around mid-afternoon, there was a knock on my door. To my surprise, Landon stepped inside carrying a paper coffee cup and looking more exhausted than I had ever seen him. He hesitated before speaking. Hey, I hadn't expected him to come. You came back, he nodded awkwardly. I caught an earlier flight this morning. He pulled a chair closer to the bed but didn't sit immediately. Mom and Dad stayed. Of course they did. I wasn't even surprised anymore. Landon finally lowered himself into the chair. I didn't know how bad it was until yesterday. I studied his face. He looked genuinely shaken. Did they tell you what happened? Not really. He rubbed the back of his neck. Mom just kept saying you'd overworked yourself. I reached toward the folder on the bedside table and handed him the copies of his medical records. Do these look familiar? He frowned as he flipped through the pages. Yeah. These were my annual heart checkups. He looked up at me, confused. Why do you have them? Because I never had mine. He laughed once, softly, expecting it to be a joke. When he realized I wasn't smiling, the color drained from his face. Wait. He looked back at the paperwork. You mean? I was never screened. He stared at me for several seconds without speaking. That's impossible. Apparently not. His eyes moved across the reports again before stopping on the highlighted recommendation that every child should be tested. I watched realization slowly settle over him. I thought, he began quietly, I thought we both did these appointments. I shook my head. No. Dad always took me during school breaks. He looked genuinely lost. I never asked why you weren't there. Why would you? I replied. You were a kid. Landon lowered his head into his hands. I swear to you, Maren, I didn't know. For the first time since waking up in the hospital, I believed someone in my family. There wasn't calculation in his voice. There wasn't defensiveness, just shock. Do you remember Grandpa? I asked. Little. Do you remember anyone ever talking about why he died? Landon frowned. Dad always said it was just. I nodded slowly. That's what he told me too. Landon looked at the documents one more time before whispering, Why would he hide this from you? I didn't answer because I didn't know, or maybe I was finally starting to know, and the answer hurt too much to say aloud. Later that evening, my father called. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. Good news, he announced. Your mother and I changed our flights. We'll be home tomorrow. I almost laughed at the timing. Why? Landon told us you've been asking a lot of questions. There was a pause. We should clear up a few misunderstandings. Misunderstandings. That word landed like ice in my stomach, I said quietly. Did a cardiologist ever tell you that both of your children needed heart screenings? Silence. It lasted only a few seconds, but it felt endless. Then he answered in a calm voice that chilled me even more than if he had shouted. We'll discuss that when I get home. He ended the call before I could ask another question. I stared at the dark screen, realizing something important. If there had been an innocent explanation, he would have given it immediately. Instead, he wanted time. Time to prepare. Time to control the conversation. Time to decide which version of the truth he wanted me to hear. As I placed the phone back on the table, another call came in almost immediately. The caller, it displayed a name I hadn't expected to see in months. Daniel Foster, my grandmother's attorney, I answered, still trying to steady my breathing. Mr. Foster, Maren, he said gently. I'm very sorry to hear about your hospitalization. Thank you. There's something your grandmother instructed me to deliver personally when the time was right. My heart skipped, this time from surprise rather than illness. What do you mean? She left very specific instructions. He paused before continuing. She asked that you come to my office alone. She was very clear that no one else, not even your parents, should be present. My grip tightened around the phone. Somehow, I knew that whatever my grandmother had left behind was connected to everything that was finally beginning to unravel. I had always thought my grandmother saw me differently because I happened to spend more time with her. It never crossed my mind that she might have understood my family better than anyone else. 2 days after I was discharged from the hospital, I drove to Daniel Foster's office with a folder full of medical records on the passenger seat and more questions than answers. Dieter Pierce had insisted I take things slowly, warning me that stress could trigger another episode while my medications were still being adjusted. I promised her I would be careful. The truth was, I wasn't sure my heart could handle whatever I was about to learn. Daniel Foster greeted me personally in the lobby. He had represented my grandparents for as long as I could remember. As a child, I used to think he looked too serious to smile. That afternoon, however, his expression carried genuine kindness. "It's good to see you standing," he said as he shook my hand. "Your grandmother would be relieved." Hearing those words almost brought tears to my eyes. "I wish she was still here." "So do I." He led me into a quiet conference room where a thick envelope and several neatly organized folders waited on the table. Before sitting down, he closed the door carefully. "Your grandmother left very specific instructions regarding this meeting," he began. "She insisted it take place only after her passing, and only if you attended alone." I looked around the empty room. She really wrote that. Word for word. He opened one folder and slid a notarized document toward me. My grandmother's signature appeared at the bottom. There it was in unmistakable handwriting. "This meeting is to be held with Maren Ellsworth only. No other family member is to attend or receive copies without her written consent." I swallowed hard. "Why?" Daniel gave me a sympathetic smile. "She believed there would come a day when you would need to make decisions without anyone influencing you." That sentence stayed with me. Without anyone influencing me. My entire life had been shaped by other people's expectations. The idea of making decisions solely for myself felt almost unfamiliar. Daniel opened another folder. "As you know, your grandmother established a family trust several years before she passed away." I nodded. I had known the trust existed, but my parents rarely discussed it. My father always implied everything would eventually be divided equally. "There are several beneficiaries," Daniel continued. "However, your grandmother appointed only one trustee." He looked directly at me. "You." For a moment I thought I had misunderstood. "Me?" "Yes." He pushed the official paperwork closer. My name appeared beside the words sole acting trustee. "Your grandmother trusted your judgment more than anyone else's." I stared at the document in disbelief. "My parents never mentioned this. They were aware the trust existed," Daniel replied carefully. They were not informed of every detail. He paused before adding, "That was your grandmother's choice." My mind raced. What exactly does a trustee do? You ensure her wishes are carried out exactly as written. You don't create new rules. You don't change her intentions. You simply protect them. I felt both honored and terrified. Can someone challenge it? Anyone can try. Daniel folded his hands together. But your grandmother anticipated that possibility. She left very clear language limiting interference. He reached for the large envelope resting beside the folders. There's one more thing. The envelope had my name written across the front in my grandmother's familiar handwriting. My chest tightened. I hadn't seen her handwriting since the funeral. She asked that you read this only after everything else had been explained. My fingers shook as I opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter spanning several pages. I recognized the slight slant of every sentence immediately. "My dearest Maren," it began, "if you are reading this, it means I'm no longer there to tell you what I've been trying to tell you for years." My vision blurred before I finished the first paragraph. Daniel quietly stepped toward the window, giving me privacy while I continued reading. "You have spent your entire life believing love must be earned through sacrifice. I watched you give away birthdays, opportunities, vacations, and pieces of yourself because you hoped someone would finally choose you. I need you to understand something I wish I had said sooner. The people who truly love you should never require you to disappear for them." Tears rolled down my face. My grandmother had seen everything. The dinners where I quietly cleared dishes while everyone celebrated Landon. The holidays where I cooked while everyone else opened presents. The countless moments I convinced myself didn't matter. They had mattered to someone. I kept reading. "I know your parents love you in their own imperfect way, but love without fairness becomes neglect, and neglect repeated long enough becomes a habit that families mistake for normal. Never confuse sacrifice with love, my sweet girl." I covered my mouth with one hand, trying not to cry aloud. Every sentence felt like she was sitting across from me, saying the words she never had the chance to speak. The final page stopped me completely. "That is why I chose you. Not because you are stronger than everyone else. Because you are kinder. Kindness must never be mistaken for weakness. If anyone asks you to ignore my wishes for the sake of family harmony, remember this harmony built on one person's silence is not peace. It is surrender." I lowered the letter slowly. Daniel returned to the table after giving me a few minutes. "Your grandmother was an extraordinary woman," he said quietly. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. "She knew?" I finally whispered. "She knew exactly what was happening." "I believe she did." Daniel hesitated before continuing. "She often worried that you apologized for things that weren't your fault." That sentence hurt because it was true. I apologized when my father was angry. I apologized when my mother was disappointed. I apologized whenever Landon forgot something, because I assumed I should have reminded him. Somewhere along the way, apologizing had become my first instinct, even when I was the one being hurt. Daniel handed me another document explaining the trust's distribution schedule. My grandmother had established education funds for future great-grandchildren, charitable donations to the local library and animal shelter, and specific financial gifts to several relatives. Everything was organized with remarkable precision. My role wasn't to decide who deserved what. It was simply to make sure every instruction was honored exactly as she intended. "Has anyone else asked about the trust?" I wondered. Daniel gave a small smile that answered the question before he spoke. "Your father has called my office several times since your grandmother's passing." I wasn't surprised. What did he want? Who believed certain adjustments should be made because circumstances had changed. I looked up sharply. "Adjustments?" Daniel nodded. "He suggested some distributions be handled differently." "Did you tell him no?" "I told him only the trustee could authorize anything." He paused. He assumed that responsibility would eventually fall to him. Before I could respond, my phone vibrated on the table. The caller had read Dad. I stared at the screen until the ringing stopped. Seconds later another call came. Then another. Finally, a text message appeared. Daniel told me you met with him. Call me immediately. We need to discuss the trust before you make any mistakes. I read the message twice before quietly placing the phone face down. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel guilty for ignoring my father's demands. I looked at Daniel and took a slow, steady breath. I think, I said calmly, I'm finally ready to stop letting everyone else decide what's best for me. The strange thing about people who have controlled you for years is that they never imagine losing that control. My father didn't call because he wanted to know how I was recovering. He called because he believed I might do something he couldn't predict. That realization should have made me angry. Instead, it made me strangely calm. For the first time in my life, I wasn't reacting to my family's expectations. I was simply listening to my own judgment. As I drove home from Daniel Foster's office, my phone rang 6 more times. Every call came from either my father or my mother. I ignored every one of them. 10 minutes after I pulled into my driveway, someone knocked loudly on my front door. I looked through the window before opening it. Richard stood outside with Claire beside him. My father's jaw was tight. My mother's eyes were already red from crying. I unlocked the door but didn't invite them inside. We need to talk, my father said immediately. We do, I answered calmly. But not on your schedule anymore. He frowned, clearly surprised by my tone. Maren, don't start this. Start what? I asked. Conversation? Claire stepped forward before Richard could answer. Honey, please. We've all been under so much stress. I looked at her quietly. I almost died. She lowered her eyes. I know. No, I said softly. You know now? When I called you from that parking lot, you told me to stop acting. Tears immediately filled her eyes. I didn't think. Exactly. She covered her mouth, unable to answer. Richard finally spoke. We're not here to argue about the hospital. Really? I replied. Because I still have questions you never answered. He crossed his arms. Daniel called me after your meeting. I'm sure he didn't. My father hesitated. He realized his mistake almost immediately. Daniel would never have discussed confidential matters. Richard corrected himself. I assumed you met with him because he refused to return my calls. That's closer to the truth. His expression hardened. Your grandmother's trust is a complicated legal matter. You don't have experience managing something that large. I almost smiled. Dad, I'm a financial planner. For the first time since he arrived, he had no immediate response. Claire stepped between us. Your father only means that these decisions affect the whole family. No, I answered. Grandma already made the decisions. I'm only carrying them out. Richard took one step closer. Some of those instructions should be adjusted. Why? Circumstances have changed. How? He hesitated. Landon is starting his career. He'll need more support. There it was again. Even after everything that had happened, the conversation somehow returned to my brother's future. I folded my arms. Grandma knew Landon was graduating when she updated the trust. That was before? Before what? I interrupted. Before I almost died because nobody thought my health mattered. Silence settled over the porch. My father looked away first. You're making emotional decisions. I shook my head slowly. No, for once, I'm making objective ones, he exhaled sharply. You owe this family. I stared at him, almost unable to believe he had actually said the words aloud. Do I? He nodded. Everything you've accomplished happened because of this family. I let out a quiet laugh. It wasn't mocking, it was simply disbelief. Dad, I paid my own way through graduate school. He said nothing. I bought this house myself. Still nothing. I built my career without asking either of you for $1. Claire wiped tears from her cheeks. Please don't do this. I'm not doing anything, I replied. I'm following Grandma's instructions. Richard's voice became colder. Family comes first. I've spent 35 years believing that. I met his eyes steadily. The problem is, I was apparently the only one who believed it. Neither of them answered. After several uncomfortable seconds, my father turned and walked toward his car without another word. My mother lingered behind. She looked smaller than I had ever seen her. Can we talk? She asked quietly. Just us? I hesitated before nodding. Richard drove away alone. Claire sat across from me at my kitchen table while untouched cups of tea cooled between us. For several minutes she simply stared at her hands. Finally she whispered, "I've replayed that phone call every night since it happened." I remained silent. "I keep hearing your voice." Tears slipped down her face. "You sounded so scared." She nodded slowly. "I know. I waited." She took a shaky breath. "I've asked myself why I didn't listen." Her voice cracked. "The only answer I can find is that I had gotten used to believing you would always be okay." I looked at her carefully. "Because I always was." She closed her eyes. "You never needed us the way Landon did." "Mum," I interrupted gently, "I needed you. I just stopped asking." That sentence broke something inside her. She began crying openly, no longer trying to hide it. "I should have protected you," she whispered. "There were so many times I should have said something. Why didn't you?" She looked toward the window before answering. "Because keeping peace became easier than confronting your father." Her honesty surprised me. It didn't erase the years of hurt, but it was the first truthful conversation we'd had in a very long time. Before either of us could continue, another knock sounded at the door. Landon stepped inside carrying an overnight bag. He looked from our mother to me before speaking. "Dad left." Claire nodded. Landon sat beside me. I confronted him this morning, my eyebrows lifted. About the medical records. He swallowed hard. "I asked why I had yearly heart screenings and you didn't." "What did he say?" Landon stared at the floor. At first he denied remembering. Then he admitted the doctors recommended testing both of us. My heartbeat quickened. "He admitted it." Landon nodded slowly. He said, his voice faltered, "He thought you were healthier. He believed I was more likely to inherit Grandpa's condition because I looked more like Grandpa." I stared at him in disbelief. "That's not even how genetics work." "I know." Landon's eyes filled with tears. "Deidre, Pierce explained that to me this morning." I looked at him, confused. "You spoke to Deidre Pierce?" I asked if she'd answer a few questions. He rubbed his forehead. "She couldn't discuss your private information, but she explained how inherited heart conditions generally work." He shook his head. Dad wasn't just wrong. He ignored medical advice. The room fell silent again. For years I had wondered whether I was imagining the favoritism. Now even Landon couldn't defend it. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small envelope. "There's something else." "What's that?" "Dad gave this to me yesterday." I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a handwritten note from my father. It wasn't an apology. It was a list of talking points about the trust and suggestions for convincing me to make reasonable adjustments before meeting with Daniel again. I looked up slowly. "He wanted you to persuade me." Landon nodded, ashamed. "Instead, I brought it to you." I folded the paper neatly and placed it back inside the envelope. In that moment, I realized something important. My father still believed he could control the outcome. He just hadn't realized the people around him were beginning to stop following his script. I stood and walked toward the living room bookshelf where my grandmother's letter rested inside its envelope. Tomorrow, the entire family would meet with Daniel Foster for the final review of the trust. My father thought he was walking into a negotiation. He had no idea he was about to hear the one voice he could no longer argue with. His own mother's. I used to think justice arrived with raised voices, dramatic confessions, or the kind of endings you see in movies. I was wrong. Sometimes justice arrives in complete silence, when the truth no longer needs anyone to defend it. The meeting at Daniel Foster's office took place the following afternoon. I arrived 10 minutes early, carrying my grandmother's letter and the trust documents in a simple leather folder. My heart still tired more easily than it used to, but every step into that building felt lighter than the one before. Daniel greeted me with a quiet smile before leading me into the conference room. A long oak table sat in the center, with neatly arranged folders at each seat. Sunlight streamed through the windows, making the room feel almost peaceful. It struck me as ironic that the most difficult conversation of my life would happen in such a calm place. A few minutes later, my parents arrived together. Richard walked in confidently, wearing the same expression he always wore before a business negotiation. Claire looked exhausted. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and she avoided looking directly at me. Landon entered last. Instead of sitting beside our father, he chose the chair next to mine. Richard noticed immediately. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Daniel waited until everyone had settled before speaking. "Thank you all for coming." He placed both hands on the table. "Today's meeting concerns the execution of Evelyn Brooks' trust exactly as she instructed." My father interrupted almost immediately. "Before we begin, I'd like to discuss several practical revisions." Daniel calmly shook his head. "There will be no revisions unless the trustee determines they are legally appropriate under the trust's terms." Richard looked at me. "Maren, surely you understand flexibility is sometimes necessary." I met his eyes without anger. Grandma didn't ask me to be flexible. She asked me to protect her wishes. Daniel opened the official binder. For nearly 40 minutes, he reviewed every section of the trust: educational funds, charitable donations, individual gifts, maintenance of my grandparents' historic home. Everything had already been carefully planned years before her death. There were no surprises in the legal documents themselves. The surprise came when Daniel reached into his briefcase and removed another sealed envelope. "Mrs. Brooks left one additional statement," he said. "She requested that it be read aloud if disagreements arose regarding her intentions." Richard shifted in his chair. "That's unnecessary." Daniel looked at him politely. It was her instruction. The room became completely silent as Daniel unfolded the pages. His voice remained steady while he read. "To my family, if these words are being read, it means someone has forgotten that fairness matters more than convenience. I have watched my grandchildren grow into very different people. One has often been celebrated loudly. The other has quietly carried responsibilities no child should have carried alone." I felt tears gathering before he even continued. "Maren has spent years believing her worth depended on how much she was willing to give away. I hope one day she understands that love should never require someone to become invisible." Claire began crying softly. Richard stared at the table without moving. Daniel continued. "If anyone believes Maren is too emotional to carry out my wishes, I would remind them that kindness and weakness are not the same thing. I chose her because she listens before judging, because she protects before taking, and because she has repeatedly shown more integrity than anyone realizes." I glanced toward my father. For the first time in my life, he looked genuinely shaken. Then Daniel reached the final paragraph. "If my son believes he deserves authority simply because he is the father, let him remember this leadership is earned through fairness, not demanded through position. A parent who consistently asks one child to sacrifice for another should not be surprised when that child eventually chooses peace over approval." No one spoke after the letter ended. Even the air in the room felt heavier. Richard remained motionless for several seconds before slowly lifting his head. She misunderstood. His voice lacked its usual confidence. Daniel quietly folded the letter. "Auras. Brooks revised this statement twice over the course of 4 years. I assure you, she understood exactly what she wished to say." My father turned toward me. "Maren." His voice cracked for the first time I could ever remember. "I made mistakes." I waited. "I thought I was protecting the family." "Which family?" I asked gently. He looked confused. "Or family?" "No." I shook my head. "You protected one child and expected the other to understand forever." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing left to argue. The medical records existed. The trust existed. My grandmother's words existed. None of them depended on my opinion anymore. They simply told the truth. Claire finally reached across the table toward me. "I'm so sorry." Her tears fell freely now. I kept telling myself that staying quiet kept the family together. I looked at her with sadness instead of anger. It kept the peace for everyone except me. She nodded slowly. "I know." Beside me, Landon cleared his throat. "Can I say something?" Everyone turned toward him. He looked directly at me. "I've spent my whole life accepting things I never questioned. Every opportunity, every extra dollar, every bit of attention. He swallowed hard. I didn't ask where those things came from because I assumed that's just how families worked. His eyes filled with tears. I'm sorry I never noticed what they were costing you. I reached over and squeezed his hand. You were a child. Not forever. He answered quietly. I should have seen it sooner. That was enough for me. Real apologies don't erase the past. They simply stop pretending it never happened. Daniel finished reviewing the remaining legal paperwork before sliding the final signature page toward me. Mrs. Ellsworth, he said formally, are you prepared to execute the trust according to Mrs. Brooks' instructions? I looked around the table one last time. My father sat silently, no longer trying to negotiate. My mother continued wiping away tears. Landon gave me a small nod of encouragement. I picked up the pen. Yes, I answered. Exactly as she intended. I signed my name. It took less than 10 seconds. Somehow it also ended 5 years of believing my value depended on making everyone else comfortable. After the meeting ended, my parents walked toward the parking lot together. My father stopped beside his car and turned back to face me. He looked older than he had only a week earlier. Will you ever forgive me? He asked quietly. I thought carefully before answering. Maybe someday. Hope flickered across his face. Then I continued. But forgiveness and access aren't the same thing. He lowered his eyes, understanding exactly what I meant. I wasn't punishing him. I was protecting myself. As they drove away, Landon stayed behind. We stood together outside Daniel's office watching the afternoon traffic move through town. What now? He asked. I smiled, and for the first time in years, it felt completely genuine. No, I learn what life feels like when I stop trying to earn love that should have been freely given. 3 months later, I accepted a promotion with my firm and relocated to a city closer to the coast. My cardiologist was pleased with my recovery. My medications were working, and I had learned to slow down without feeling guilty. Landon visited a few times during that first year. We didn't pretend the past hadn't happened, but we built something honest that had never existed before. My parents wrote letters. Sometimes I answered. Sometimes I didn't. They finally understood that a relationship could no longer exist on their terms alone. The greatest karma wasn't that they lost money. It wasn't public embarrassment. It wasn't legal consequences. Their greatest loss was realizing the daughter, who had spent her entire life holding the family together, had quietly learned how to build a peaceful life without needing their permission. Looking back now, I realized the day my heart nearly gave out wasn't the day my life fell apart. It was the day I finally stopped begging to be chosen. And once I chose myself, everything else slowly found its rightful place. A year has passed since the day my heart almost gave out in that parking lot. And sometimes I still catch myself reaching for my phone whenever something good or bad happens, forgetting for a split second that my life no longer revolves around waiting for my family's approval. My cardiologist says my condition is well managed now. I take my medication every morning, keep every appointment, and for the first time in my life, I treat my own health as something worth protecting instead of something that can always wait until everyone else's needs are met. My new office overlooks the water, and every Friday evening I walk along the shoreline before driving home. It has become my reminder that peace isn't something another person gives you. It's something you choose, often after letting go of people who never learned how to protect it. Landon and I still talk regularly. Our relationship isn't perfect, but it's honest, and that honesty means more than pretending the past never happened. He eventually began volunteering with a heart disease awareness organization, telling people that early screening saves lives because he knows better than anyone how close our family came to losing me. My mother still writes letters every few weeks. Some I answer. Some I simply read and place back in their envelopes. She no longer asks me to come home for every holiday. Instead, she thanks me whenever I do. That small change tells me she finally understands that my presence is a gift, not an obligation. My father changed more slowly. Pride doesn't disappear overnight. But 6 months after our meeting with Daniel Foster, he quietly donated money to the cardiac clinic where I had been treated, asking that part of it be used for family genetic screening programs. He never told me himself. I learned about it from Droda Pierce, who smiled and said, "Sometimes guilt becomes responsibility if people are willing to face it." We still aren't close, but for the first time in my life, I believe he understands the weight of the choices he made. As for my grandmother's trust, every instruction was carried out exactly as she intended. The scholarships were funded, the charities received their gifts, and her legacy remained exactly as she had envisioned. I didn't change a single line, because honoring her wishes turned out to be the greatest act of love I could offer. Looking back, I realized the real karma wasn't watching my family lose control or seeing their regrets catch up with them. The real karma was that I finally stopped believing I had to earn love by sacrificing myself. The day I chose my own well-being was the day my life truly began. If my story proves anything, it's this: the people who deserve a place in your life will never ask you to disappear so they can feel more comfortable. So now I want to ask you something. If you were in my place, would you have made the same choice? Or would you have given your family one more chance?